The price of uncharted soil. The air in the Connecticut Valley of 1648 was a raw, biting thing, tasting perpetually of pine sap and the distant iron-tinged smoke of burning hearths. It clung to the rough-spun wool of the settlers like a second skin, a constant reminder that this was not the gentle, cultivated soil of old England. This was uncharted soil, and every foot of it had been bought, not with coin, but with the sweat of backs and the silence of unanswered prayers. The settlement of Havenwood, barely a decade old, was less a town and more a collection of stubborn wooden teeth clenched against the vast, dark maw of the wilderness. The palisade, crude yet essential, stood as a thin membrane between civilization and the untamed world that watched from the deeper woods. It was a fragile existence, built on the fervent conviction that God had set this land aside for his chosen people, though the cost of claiming that inheritance was proving to be staggering. The weight of the plow. Elias Thorne leaned against the rough-hewn frame of his newly built barn, the rising sun failing to cut through the perpetual morning fog clinging to the river bend. His hands, permanently calloused, gripped the handles of a primitive plow, its iron tip stubbornly refusing to turn the thick, root-laden earth. He was 35. But the relentless labor had etched lines around his eyes that belonged to a man twice his age. "She fights us, Elias," muttered Silas Croft. His eldest son had lost him to the winter sickness the previous year, a loss the community quietly acknowledged was the first true price paid for this freedom. "The soil here, it holds on to the past." Elias grunted in agreement. The ground wasn't just stubborn, it felt resentful. It concealed stones the size of a man's head, and roots that snapped the oxen's traces. They had not found fields ready for sowing. They had found a battlefield, and the planting season was a skirmish they dared not lose. The harvest last year had been barely sufficient. The near starvation, a specter that haunted every council meeting. Freedom, Elias realized with a chilling certainty, was not a gift bestowed. It was a commodity constantly being bought and rebought with every sunrise. He thought of his wife, Martha, inside their small cabin, tending to their 3 remaining children. Their very survival was the ledger upon which the price of this soil was recorded. Martha's vigil and the silent threat. Inside the cabin, Martha Thorne was grinding corn, the rhythmic thump-thump of the mortar and pestle, a counterpoint to the wind howling softly around the chinks in the logs. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint, sweet scent of dried herbs she was reserving for potential fevers. She rarely complained, but her vigilance was a constant, sharp note in their domestic life. Her concern was twofold. First, the provisions were dwindling faster than anticipated, their stock of salted pork alarmingly thin. And second, and far more unsettling, were the tracks she'd seen near the edge of their small clearing just 3 days prior. They weren't the neat, familiar prints of deer or the heavy tread of bear. These were undeniably human, yet unsettlingly silent, the soft crush of moccasins on pine needles. The unspoken tension between the settlers and the native tribes, the Massachusetts and the Pequot, whose ancestral lands they now occupied, was the greatest liability of Havenwood. Governor Winthrop's letters often spoke of Providence, but Martha saw only a ticking clock. The treaties were paper-thin, and the past held memories darker than any winter fog. She remembered the grim accounts of early skirmishes, the colonists' justifications always couched in righteous necessity. Necessity. That was the word used to excuse taking land, to justify the escalating tensions. Martha knew that deeper they pushed into the valley, the more they encroached upon hunting grounds and sacred sites. Today, however, the fear took a physical form. As she glanced out the single oiled paper window, she saw a figure standing motionless near the palisade gate. Tall, clad in buckskin, observing the morning routine. It was not a friend, a term whispered in the dark when the children were asleep. The man's posture was still, but his presence was a thunderclap announcing the debt was due. The Council of Hard Choices. By midday, the tension had drawn every able man to the small, fortified meeting house. Elias, Silas, and the stern elder Hawthorne presided over a makeshift table of stacked crates. The flickering light from the single tallow candle illuminated the grim faces. "The tracks are fresh," Elias stated, his voice low but carrying the weight of command he never sought but often held. 2 men, perhaps 3. They didn't approach the perimeter aggressively, but they were watching Martha this morning. Elder Hawthorne, a man whose severity was matched only by his conviction, slammed a fist on the table. "They test us. They see our weak harvest, our diminished numbers, and they believe the Lord has forsaken us. We must show strength. We must send a patrol, armed and ready." Silas shifted uncomfortably. "Strength invites escalation, Elder. We have lost men to sickness, yes, but we've lost none to direct conflict since 42. Sending armed men across the boundary is an act of war. We have tools, not soldiers." "We are soldiers of Christ, Silas. The soil we till is consecrated by our faith," Hawthorne retorted, his voice rising to a near shriek. Elias intervened before the argument could boil over. He understood both perspectives, the fear of provoking violence and the terrifying knowledge that appearing weak invited predation. "We will not patrol aggressively," Elias said, his decision ringing through the room. "We will offer a gift, a gesture of peace, not submission. We will send Thomas, alone. He carries the finest linen we have left and a side of smoked venison. It is an acknowledgment of their presence, a price for continued quiet. If they refuse the offering, then we know their intent and we prepare for what must come next." The silence that followed was heavy. Sending a single man, unarmed save for his piety and a gift, felt like offering the butcher a choice of which piece to carve first. But it was a gamble rooted in the hope that the natives valued trade and respect over immediate confrontation. The true price of the soil, Elias knew, was not just the land itself, but the constant, agonizing calculus of how much risk to absorb before fighting back. The dawn of reckoning. The next morning was the longest Elias's life. Thomas, a young carpenter with a surprisingly steady gaze, had left before dawn, the meager offering bundled tightly to his back. Elias and Silas stood near the gate, the fog so thick they could barely see 20 yards into the woods. Every snapping twig, every call of a distant bird sounded like the approach of doom. The sun finally burned off the mist around mid-morning, revealing the vast, silent forest. The woods offered no answers, only the oppressive weight of potential observation. Then, a sound. Not a threat, but a rhythm. A figure emerged slowly from the trees, just outside the agreed-upon boundary. It was the silent watcher from Martha's morning observation. But this time he was not alone. He walked with an ancient dignity, accompanied by an older woman whose face was a roadmap of weathered history. Behind them, two more younger men stood ready, unmoving, observing. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Elias took a deep, shuddering breath. The gamble had failed, or perhaps it had ended too quickly. The elders' faction was already reaching for their muskets, resting near the gateposts. "Hold!" Elias roared, stepping forward, his shadow falling across the dew-dampened grass. "Do not fire! Wait for word!" The lead man, whom Elias judged to be a chief or respected elder, stopped just outside the clearing.
The lead man, whom Elias judged to be a chief or respected elder, stopped just outside the clearing. He did not shout, he did not gesture. He simply stood, his eyes locking onto Elias. The chief raised his hand slowly, not in challenge, but in command. From the shadows behind him, Thomas finally stepped out. He was unharmed, but his eyes held the same distant, unsettling knowledge as the chief's. The chief lowered his hand, and the woman beside him stepped forward, not towards the colonists, but towards the earth itself. She knelt slowly, picked up a handful of the dark, rich soil, looked at it, and then let it sift through her fingers back onto the ground. Her expression was one of deep, profound sorrow. She did not speak English, but her meaning, conveyed in that single deliberate act of reclaiming the earth only to release it, spoke volumes to every settler watching. It was the visual confirmation. This land demanded a sacrifice beyond the planting of seed and the building of walls. The price was not just hard work. The price was stolen memory, broken tradition, and the silent erosion of peace. And that price, Elias knew with a chilling finality, had only just begun to be tallied. A debt forged in powder smoke. The summer of 1650 did not bring the settlers of Havenwood the peace they had desperately sought. If Chapter 1 had been the silent accrual of debt, Chapter 2 was the explosive demand for immediate payment. The fragile truce, symbolized by the quiet departure of the indigenous woman and her elder, had frayed into open suspicion, worn thin by escalating incidents, a calf gone missing, a fishing net slashed, and the constant, unnerving sense of being watched from the thickets. The air was heavy, not just with the humidity of the New England summer, but with the suffocating expectation of violence. Elias Thorne felt the pressure acutely. The fear had curdled the community's piety into paranoia. Elder Hawthorne's sermons had sharpened into fiery condemnations of the savage hand and calls for preemptive defense, dividing the town against Elias's cooler insistence on caution. The men of Havenwood, primarily farmers and carpenters, were now spending more time drilling with their matchlocks than tending their fields, their debt to the land forgotten in the face of an immediate, terrifying threat. The unseen perimeter. One sweltering afternoon, Elias and Silas were mending the southern palisade wall, a necessary but tedious task that offered little defense against a determined attack. Elias noticed a new detail that curdled his blood. The bark on the largest pine outside the gate was scored deeply, a recent mark, easily missed. It wasn't a casual inscription, it was a deliberate symbol, one that Elias did not recognize, but which carried the weight of a dire warning. "Look, Silas," Elias murmured, pointing with his hammer. "It wasn't here yesterday. It's a line drawn in blood, even if the bark is all that bleeds." Silas squinted, his face pale beneath his sweat. "They are counting the days, Elias. They are marking what is theirs and what is ours. We are building a wall, but they are drawing the map." Their conversation was cut short by a shrill, piercing cry, the signal whistle from the northern watchtower, repeated 3 times, rapid and desperate. That was the alarm for immediate danger, not observation. Elias dropped his tools and sprinted toward the meeting house, the familiar smell of wood smoke in the valley suddenly replaced by a sharp, acrid scent, the smell of powder smoke. The ambush at Black Creek. The attack was not aimed at the fortified settlement, but to the lifeline, Black Creek, the settlement's primary source of clean water and the small milling station located a quarter-mile downriver. A scouting party of 6 men, led by Thomas, the same young man who had carried the peace offering, had been ambushed while surveying timber. When Elias and a hastily armed contingent of 15 men reached the creek bank, the scene was of brutal, chaotic necessity. 2 of Thomas's men were down, one lying still, the other clutching a grievous wound to his thigh. The remaining 4 were pinned behind the mill's rough foundation, desperately trying to reload their cumbersome muskets while arrows whizzed from the dense brush across the water. "They've cut us off from the water," Thomas yelled, his face streaked with grime and fear, yet his voice surprisingly steady. "They didn't want the mill. They want the men. It's a message." This wasn't a dispute over borders. This was an intentional bloodletting, a clear retaliation for the settlers' encroachment. The sight of his fallen men, the smell of burnt sulfur mixing with the coppery tang of blood, this was the moment Elias realized the full, terrible meaning of the debt. It was no longer abstract. It was an obligation of violence. "Silas, take 3 men, flank right, keep low by the river reeds. Don't engage unless you have clear sight. We need to suppress their fire so Thomas can pull the wounded back to the trees," Elias commanded, his voice raw but precise. He raised his heavy matchlock. The weapon was unreliable, but in this moment, the act of aiming and firing felt like the only currency that mattered. The exchange of gunfire was deafening and terrifyingly brief. The tribesmen, likely a small, highly mobile raiding party, did not intend a protracted siege. They intended to inflict maximum casualties and disappear back into the vast, protective forest. Elias fired, the recoil slamming against his shoulder, the heavy ball tearing through the leaves. He did not know if he struck his target, but the immediate cessation of arrow fire from that sector allowed Thomas and his remaining men to drag their wounded comrade, William, to relative safety behind a massive, fallen oak. As the indigenous fire subsided and the ominous quiet returned, signaling the raiders' withdrawal, Elias rushed to William's side. The wound was deep, the femoral artery likely hit. Martha's knowledge of herbs and salves was a mile away, and William was bleeding out in the mud of the creek bank. "God forgive me, Elias. I should have seen them," William gasped, his eyes pleading for a release that Elias could not give. He tore a strip from his own shirt, tying it crudely above the wound in a desperate attempt to staunch the flow. But the effort was futile. As William's breathing slowed, he reached out and weakly grabbed Elias's forearm. "Tell Martha that the ground, it demanded too much." William's death was not quick. It was a slow, agonizing payment made in front of Elias. It was a debt Elias now owned personally, not to his community or to God, but to the land itself, which had extracted a life for a plot of corn. The scent of powder smoke and fresh blood was no longer a temporary smell of conflict. It was the stench of their new history. In that moment, the debt was forged. The settlers were no longer temporary tenants. They were participants in a cycle of violent ownership. The weight of vengeance. The return to Havenwood was a silent, grim procession. They carried 2 bodies and 1 severely traumatized man. Elder Hawthorne met them at the gate, his face not of sorrow, but of terrible, righteous rage. "It is God's judgment upon our weakness, Elias," Hawthorne thundered, gesturing towards the dead. They did not respect the offering. They only respect the bullet. The blood of these men cries out for vengeance. The sight of William's body being carried past his widow and children ignited the dormant fury within the settlement. Elias watched as the grief of the community transformed instantly into a demand for retribution. The fear that had once counseled caution was now an engine driving them towards war.
"We must strike back, Elias," Silas urged, his face pale but resolute. "Not for vengeance, but for survival. If we let this stand, they will believe we are weak. They will return when the snow flies and finish the job." Elias looked at the faces around him, the newly widowed women, the young men loading their muskets with fresh determination, and the children watching, their innocence already scarred by the terrible sight. He knew Silas was right. Hesitation now meant the dissolution of Havenwood. The price of this uncharted soil was a commitment to its defense, a lifelong membership in a war they hadn't started, but which they were now wholly responsible for finishing. He looked at Elder Hawthorne, who was distributing powder and shot with manic energy, preparing for the inevitable expedition. "We will not follow their path, Elder," Elias said, his voice low and firm, overriding the elder's frenzied directives. "We will prepare. We will fortify. We will send a message of strength that does not require the immediate spilling of more blood. But when the snows clear, and we know their strength, then we move. We owe it to William, and we owe it to our children." The debt was settled, not in peace, but in the grim, inevitable promise of future war. Elias stood amidst the smoky remnants of the day, his hands stained, the knowledge of his first killing weighing heavily. The pines watched, silent judges in the darkening valley. The land had finally claimed them all, binding settler and native alike in a destiny secured by the smell of powder smoke. The line between loyalty and liberty. The winter that followed the attack at Black Creek was a period of grim, armed hibernation. The settlement of Havenwood, once a beacon of hopeful piety, was now a fortress fueled by fear. Elias Thorne spent his days directing the reinforcement of the palisades, and his nights haunted by the face of William, the young man whose life had become the collateral for their presence in the valley. The powder smoke had cleared, but the bitterness it left behind was a fog that clung to every soul. The moral weight of the conflict fell hardest on Elias. He had been raised on the strict Puritan doctrines of collective obedience and loyalty to the established community, believing that God's will was enacted through the town's unified purpose. Yet the actions of Elder Hawthorne and his growing faction calls for a punitive, large-scale massacre rather than strategic defense had begun to prick at the edges of his conscience. The elder was demanding loyalty to the colony's right to conquer. Elias was beginning to question the cost of that loyalty against the true meaning of liberty. The elder's edict. The turning point arrived with the spring thaw. The snow revealed not just emerging life, but a disturbing artifact. A small, rough-carved wooden doll left conspicuously on the path leading to the church. It was not a weapon, but a powerful cultural symbol. Thomas, the carpenter who had survived the ambush, recognized it immediately as a token of mourning, often left after a significant loss. It suggested the tribesmen had suffered casualties too, shifting the narrative from a one-sided attack to a mutual tragedy. Elias presented the doll at the hastily called town council meeting. "They lost men too," he argued, placing the crude figure on the table. "This is a sign of grief, not war. Perhaps we can yet negotiate. A gift of trade goods, a formal apology for crossing their boundaries." Elder Hawthorne cut him off, his voice trembling with manufactured fury. "Silence, Elias. This is blasphemy. You suggest we apologize to the heathens for standing on soil gifted to us by God Almighty? This doll is a sorcerer's curse, a sign of their savagery. We have received new orders from Boston. They send us 20 reinforcements and a clear command. Clear the land. The elder unrolled a document heavy with the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The edict was absolute. Any indigenous presence within 10 miles of the settlement was to be forcibly removed by violence if necessary. Loyalty to the distant governor and the colony's mandate now superseded any local judgment of diplomacy or peace. Martha's quiet rebellion. That evening, the conflict moved from the town house to the Thorns' small cabin. Martha was typically the quiet anchor of the family, was boiling a potent tonic of willow bark for a sick neighbor. Her gaze was steady, piercing through Elias's turmoil. "You won't go, Elias," she stated, not as a question, but as a pronouncement. Elias scrubbed his face, the weariness of 2 years of constant tension finally breaking him. "I must go, Martha. My name is on the muster list. To refuse is to be branded a traitor to the colony, to our people. To refuse is to lose our land, our home. They will brand me a rogue and take my children." Martha set down her ladle. "And what kind of liberty do we have if we must murder innocents to keep it? The governor in Boston seeks profit and political control. He does not feel the earth here, nor has he seen the grief on the faces of their women. Our loyalty is owed to our neighbors, to our covenant with God, not to a political tyrant who asks us to sin for him." His words struck him like physical blows. Martha's quiet, radical insistence on a higher moral authority stripped away the false comfort of blind obedience. The choice was clear: follow the colony's orders and maintain his standing, loyalty, or defy the edict to spare innocent lives, liberty of conscience. The rendezvous. Elias knew he could not simply refuse, he had to act. He decided to meet with the Pequot leader, the man who had stood silent at the palisade before the colony's reinforcements arrived and Elder Hawthorne's patrol was sent out. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Elias slipped out of Havenwood, taking only his rifle and the leather pouch of tobacco, a traditional offering. He met the man whose name he now knew was Wampanoag, by the great marked pine tree at the edge of the creek where William had fallen. The meeting was strained. Wampanoag did not offer a hand. He merely stood, silent and imposing. "The colony sends men," Elias began, speaking slowly, deliberately, using the few Algonquin phrases he knew and supplementing them with gestures. "They say all must leave. They will not negotiate. They seek war." Wampanoag's eyes narrowed, betraying no fear, only deep resignation. "Your great white father in the east wants the soil clean. He has always wanted the soil clean. Our elders told us, they will take the land, then they will take the memory, and then they will demand our blood." Elias offered the tobacco. "I bring a warning, not a threat. I will not lead the expedition against you, but others will. You must move your people, your women and children, beyond the Black River. That land is not covered by the mandate yet. It is the only way to save them." Wampanoag accepted the tobacco, a sign of acknowledgement, but not agreement. He looked past Elias toward the fragile lights of Havenwood. "You break the laws of your people to give this warning. You risk much for a moment of peace. Where is your loyalty, Elias Thorne?" "My loyalty is to the Lord and to the lives of the innocent. The governor's liberty is a cage for the conscience." The defiance and the exile. The next morning, Elias made his stand. In the meeting house before Elder Hawthorne, the newly arrived colonial reinforcements, and the anxious settlers, Elias refused to take command of the punitive expedition. "I will not violate the commandment against murder. This edict is a sin against God and a crime against humanity. My oath is to peace, not to the governor's ambition." Elder Hawthorne was apoplectic. "Treason, sedition. You defy the very authority that gives us shelter, Elias Thorne. You choose the savage over your own kin."
The colonial captain, a cold man named Finch, stepped forward. "You have broken the line, Thorne. You have chosen liberty over loyalty. You are hereby stripped of all standing and properties, exiled from Havenwood, and banished from the colony of Massachusetts Bay. You have 3 days to leave. Take your family and go, or face the magistrate's rope." Elias looked at Silas, who averted his gaze, his loyalty to the community preventing him from joining Elias's stand. He looked at Thomas, whose eyes held respect and pity. He had crossed the line. He had chosen the narrow, dangerous path of conscience. When he told Martha, she simply held his hand. "We are free now, Elias. Truly free, for the first time since we landed. The price of this uncharted soil is not our life, but our willingness to lose our home for our soul." As Elias Thorne prepared his small wagon, loading his family and what few supplies they could carry, the sounds of the colonial patrol marching out to clear the land echoed ominously through the pines. He had saved his soul, but had lost his place. His new life, a life of true, dangerous liberty, began not within the palisade, but out in the wilderness, running from the very people he had once sworn to protect. The true debt forged in powder smoke was not paid by the tribe, but by his own exile. Ashes of the Old World. The forest closed around Elias Thorne, Martha, and their 3 children, like the maw of a starving beast. Their exile from Havenwood was not a quiet removal. It was a violent tearing away from the only structured life they had ever known. Chapter 3 had ended with a choice: liberty over loyalty. Chapter 4 began with the unforgiving payment for that choice. They were stripped of their land, their standing, and the illusion of safety that the communal life provided. All that remained were a few supplies, their faith, and the pervasive stench of ashes of the old world, the residue of their former certainties now burned away. The old world was not just England. It was the rigid, righteous structure of the Puritan settlement, the unquestioned authority of the governor's edicts, and the belief that the wilderness was meant to be conquered rather than endured. The Trail of Abandonment. Elias drove the single, heavily laden ox cart deeper into the interior, following a faint game trail toward the unpatrolled territory near the Black River, the same direction he had advised Wampanoag to take. The first week was pure endurance. His children, Samuel 10, Abigail 8, and little Caleb 5, were frightened and bewildered, their familiar world reduced to the jolting rhythm of the cart and the constant canopy of alien pines. The emotional burden weighed heavier than the supplies. Elias kept turning his head, expecting to see the punitive patrol from Havenwood, Captain Finch and Elder Hawthorne, hot on their trail. He had not only defied the colony, but had risked his life to warn the native people. That transgression, he knew, would be seen as the gravest betrayal. "Are they chasing us, Papa?" Samuel asked one evening, his voice barely a whisper against the crackle of their small fire. "We are seeking new land, son," Elias lied, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "The ashes of my reputation are chasing us," he thought bitterly. "The ashes of our former life." Martha was the only anchor. She never complained, managing the dwindling flour, stretching the salted pork, and keeping the children focused on tasks. But Elias saw the toll in her eyes, the constant flicker of fear, but quickly suppressed by a powerful, private resolve. She was rebuilding their world atom by atom, focusing on the immediate necessities of survival rather than the grand theological narratives that had once defined their lives. The loss of their community's rigid structure was both a relief and a terror. In Havenwood, life was organized by the bell for prayer, bell for labor, bell for curfew. Now time was dictated only by the sun and the raw needs of their bodies. Elias realized that the Puritan structure, which he had sacrificed for his liberty of conscience, had also provided a necessary comfort, certainty. He had always known his place, his duty, and his neighbor's loyalty. Now he was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of his own making. One morning, the ox, their primary engine of movement and labor, stumbled and collapsed. Its leg was broken, a compound fracture on the uneven ground. Elias spent a long, agonizing hour trying to splint the massive limb, but the attempt was futile. They had to leave the cart behind and butcher the animal for the meat they desperately needed, a sacrifice that meant they could now only carry what fit on their backs. As the smoke from the butchering fire rose, acrid and heavy, Elias broke down. He was a skilled farmer, a solid craftsman, a respected pillar of his town. Now he was a refugee kneeling in the dirt, the smell of burnt flesh symbolizing the sudden, violent end of his profession, his belongings, and his identity. He had believed God would reward his moral stand. Instead, God seemed only to offer silence and hardship. "The world we knew is gone, Martha. We are adrift. I fear I made a terrible mistake. I put my liberty above my family's security." Martha held him, her strength a quiet, unyielding force. "No, Elias, you put our souls first. The security they offered was a lie, built on the suffering of others. This is the old world truly burning. What we build now, we build free of those ashes." The encounter with the new world. Their journey took a terrifying turn 3 weeks from leaving the cart. Low on food and water, Elias was desperate. He left Martha and the children hidden near a small stream and ventured out to hunt, his rifle his only comfort. He hunted for hours, finding only scant tracks. Exhausted, he finally stumbled upon a patch of ground that had clearly been settled, not by colonists, but by the natives. There were the remnants of a recently abandoned campsite, cold fire pits, woven baskets left behind, and tools made of bone and stone. Wampanoagic's people had been here and moved on. As Elias was examining the site, a rustle in the undergrowth alerted him. He instinctively raised his rifle, his heart pounding. 2 figures emerged, an elderly woman dressed in tanned hide, and a young girl no older than Abigail. They were foraging. The woman stopped instantly, her eyes widening in recognition. It was the same elder who had knelt and sifted the soil at the palisade gate. She recognized Elias as the man who had warned them. The moment was suspended in time. 2 civilizations meeting in the wilderness, stripped of the pretense of formal war. The rifle was still raised, pointed at the very people Elias had risked everything to protect. The woman slowly lowered her basket. She did not flee or cry out. She spoke in her native tongue, a rush of melodious words Elias could not understand, but which carried an unexplainable tone of quiet, shared sorrow. Then she pointed to the west, where the river flowed, and then she pointed to the sky, gesturing toward the approaching storm clouds. She was warning him. Elias slowly lowered his rifle. He did not ask for food. He did not offer a threat. He nodded in acknowledgement of her warning. He had nothing to trade, no gift to give, save for the dangerous liberty he had bought. A new covenant from the ashes.
A new covenant from the ashes. Elias returned to his family, shaken but renewed. He realized the old world had taught him to see only 2 roles, master or enemy. The native elder, by offering a warning without demanding a payment, had revealed a third way, mutual survival. Following the woman's direction, Elias led his family through a treacherous pass and found a small, sheltered meadow beside a swift tributary of the Black River. It was marginal land, rocky, isolated and requiring tremendous labor, but it was their own. It was a place where no colony edicts held sway and where no church bell governed their day. As the first autumn chill set in, Elias began the arduous task of clearing the stones and felling trees for a cabin. His hands, though wounded by loss, were guided by a new kind of purpose. He was not building a fort against the world. He was building a sanctuary. One late afternoon, as he and Martha were struggling to lift the massive ridge beam into place, they discovered a small cache beneath a stone they had rolled aside, a tightly woven basket containing dried meat, cured berries, and a perfectly sharpened bone-hunting knife. The basket was simple, bearing no colonial mark. It was the quiet offering of a stranger, a debt repaid. Elias looked towards the western pines, feeling the immense weight of the forest around him. The ashes of his old world, of guaranteed protection, of communal certainty, of unearned superiority were cold now. He stood in a clearing of his own making, sustained by the unspoken grace of the people he had warned, and the fierce liberty won by his own moral defiance. He was not a Puritan of Havenwood anymore. He was a new kind of American, an exile whose freedom was forged not by conquest, but by loss, hard labor, and a newly discovered, vulnerable humanity, absolutely. This is the fifth and final chapter, The Inheritance of the Sunrise, which will resolve the main conflict of Elias's moral journey and establish the enduring legacy of his family in the New World. The Shadow of the Pines, Chapter 5. The Inheritance of the Sunrise. 2 decades passed since Elias and Martha Thorne became self-made exiles. The small, isolated clearing they founded by the tributary of the Black River was no longer a temporary sanctuary. It was a permanent home named Freehold. The ashes of the old world had settled, giving way to the rich, fertile ground of a new, complex existence. Elias was now 55, his beard streaked with white, his frame lean and hardened not by the communal discipline of Havenwood, but by the solitary, unyielding demands of the wilderness. He had learned to read the sky as much as the Bible, and to trust the silent warnings of the forest more than the loudest promises of men. Martha, the quiet pillar, had transformed Freehold into a place of true sustenance. Their small cabin now boasted 2 additions. Their fields yielded enough to trade sparingly, and their 3 children had grown into capable, independent young adults, Samuel, 30, Abigail, 28, and Caleb, 25. The greatest inheritance they possessed was not the land, but the profound, uneasy peace they shared with the land's original stewards. The warning Elias had given Wampanoag's people years ago had created an unspoken, reciprocal covenant. There was no formal treaty, no shared council fire, but a silent acknowledgement. We occupy this land with mutual respect, or we both perish. The return of the past. The serenity of Freehold was shattered one cold autumn morning. A man staggered into their clearing, collapsing from exhaustion and hunger. He was Silas Croft, Elias's former neighbor and friend from Havenwood. Silas was unrecognizable, gaunt, scarred, and haunted by a profound sorrow. Elias and Martha brought him in, fed him, and waited for the story that had taken 2 decades to be told. The colonial punitive expedition, the one Elias had refused to lead, had ended in a brutal, unnecessary massacre near the Black River. The consequences were immediate. The surrounding tribes, enraged by the atrocity, unified. Havenwood, once smug in its fortified piety, became the target. The town, which had prioritized the governor's mandate, loyalty, over Elias's plea for mercy, liberty, was overrun and burned to the ground a year after Elias's exile. The town was literally reduced to ashes. Silas, one of the few survivors, had spent the subsequent years wandering, his conscience tormented by the memory of the violence. He had sought out Elias, driven by a need to confess the town's failure and to acknowledge the terrible truth. Elias had been right. Elder Hawthorne. He believed till the end that God was on his side, Silas whispered, staring into the flames of the hearth. "But it was not God who abandoned us, Elias. We abandoned each other. We chose conquest over community, and the price was everything. The ashes of Havenwood are the ashes of the old world of our making. The arrival of Silas was more than a personal reunion. It was the final devastating confirmation that the life Elias sacrificed had been doomed by its own moral rigidity. The inheritance of the sunrise was not granted to the conquerors, but to those who sought a sustainable truth. The new generation and the line Elias's children had absorbed their parents' hard-won lessons. They did not grow up fearing the wilderness or hating the native tribes. They grew up respecting both. Samuel, the eldest, had become a skilled trapper and woodsman. He learned to track not only game, but also the seasonal movements of Wampanoag's descendants. He had mastered the art of trading with them, exchanging Freehold's superior iron tools for furs and indigenous knowledge of survival. One crisp morning, Samuel brought home an unusual find, a large iron compass, of fine European manufacture, clearly dropped in haste. It was a sign that the outside world was encroaching again, not just scattered refugees, but organized explorers or land agents. "The line is moving." "Father," Samuel said, placing the compass on the map table Elias had built, "the king in England is sending surveyors. They don't care about Havenwood's ashes or our peace with the locals. They just want lines on paper and coin in their pockets." Elias knew this was the ultimate test. His liberty was built on the premise of isolation. If the king's authority arrived, it would demand the old loyalty, bringing with it the old violence and the old destructive certainty. He had to defend not just his land, but the hard-won way of life he had established. The gathering at the River Elias decided to act immediately. He sent Caleb to follow the surveyor tracks and asked Abigail to ride to the nearest remote trading post to gather information. He then took the momentous step of breaking their long-standing, non-formal peace. He went to the place of their first meeting, the great pine tree, and left a clear, unmistakable smoke signal, a triple stack of damp pine and dry cedar, signifying urgent counsel. 2 days later, Wampanoag, now an elderly chief, walked into Freehold. He brought with him his grandson, a young man named Kitchkinet, who was the same age as Samuel. The generational symmetry was stark. Elias and Wampanoag, two leaders weary of conflict. Samuel and Kitchkinet, two young men inheriting the complex peace. "Your fire speaks with a quick tongue, Elias Thorne," Wampanoag stated, his voice now a weathered rasp. Elias showed him the compass. "The men who follow this are men of paper and power. They do not know the soil. They only know the line. They will take your land and mine. They will burn the covenant of peace we have kept for 20 seasons. We both paid a price for this soil. We must defend it together as one people." Wampanoag looked at the tool, a symbol of the destructive ambition of the old world. "The white man's loyalty is to his king. Our loyalty is to the ancestors and the Great Spirit. We know the cost of the powder smoke. What is your plan, Elias Thorne?" The inheritance of the Sunrise Elias laid out his plan. He would not fight the surveyors with violence, which would only justify the king's intervention. He would fight them with truth and unity. When the surveyors arrived, a small, arrogant crew led by the pompous Mr. Hastings, they were stunned by what they found. They expected a desolate wilderness or a hostile native camp. Instead, they found a small, thriving settlement led by Elias, and immediately adjacent to it, a carefully laid-out Pequot village, led by Wampanoag. Hastings arrogantly claimed the land in the name of the king. "This land is unpatented, Thorne. You are squatting, and these savages must be removed." Elias stepped forward, Samuel and Caleb flanking him, Martha and Abigail standing watchfully by the cabin. On the opposite side stood Wampanoag, Kitchkinet, and the assembled Pequot families. "This land is not unpatented, sir," Elias declared, his voice ringing with the authority of the soil. "My family has cultivated this soil for 20 years, paying its price in blood, sweat, and moral fortitude. And we hold covenant with the Pequot people who have been here for 200 years. We are not squatters. We are its guardians." He paused, then delivered the final crippling blow. "The king's mandate is to clear the land. But we are a unified community. If you attack the Pequot, you attack my family. If you seize my home, you seize their village. The king's law is not prepared to declare war on the very settlers he intends to place here. Hastings was confounded. He could easily overwhelm Elias alone, but he could not justify attacking a settler population that was visibly allied with the native people. He had expected to find a line of conflict. He found a line of unity. He was forced to retreat, promising to return with greater authority, but the immediate threat was averted. As the sun broke over the eastern pines, casting long, triumphant rays across the valley, the true inheritance of the sunrise, Elias stood shoulder to shoulder with Wampanoag. They had not just saved their land. They had forged a new American reality. The legacy was not one of conquest, but of compromise and enduring mutual respect. Elias's children would inherit not the wealth of the old world, nor the rigidity of the Puritan one, but the profound, dangerous, and essential liberty won by his moral sacrifice. A liberty secured by the knowledge that the true owner of the uncharted soil was the one willing to share it.